I would also like to thank Ingmarie and Andy for the invitation to participate in this session. So my presentation is going to be a little bit less exotic, maybe not so exciting, but it's based on some recent research on some Iberian stelae, and the idea is to show, like, in response to the session proposal, to contribute to this question: what would a focus on art making bring to our dealings or research on prehistoric art? So prehistoric art has been traditionally studied as iconography devoid of materiality. There has been a lot of description been made, and usually images have been conceptualized as finished products. So there are many works, classic works, that we are all using for prehistoric art research that present images, rock art, portable art, statue menhirs, as finished products or as artworks that were made just in one intervention. The problem with that is that, and the production, like the result of this kind of research, is many categories, many types, many genres, which are necessary in a way to initially approach like large data sets, because we need to, first of all, have a previous idea of what we have in front of us. As I will show you with late Bronze Age stelae, that's the way we have approached them initially. But the problem with that is that then we are ignoring key aspects, especially for us as archaeologists, to understand them in historical terms. Well, in historical terms, in social terms, in ontological terms, independently of the theoretical perspective or the approach you want to deploy. So in this kind of traditional approaches or research, materials have not been considered, have not been analyzed. Manufacture techniques have also usually been ignored, and also the temporality of, for example, the stone in the case of rock art, also in the case of statues, or the temporality of materials, how things have changed, or the transformations that they have experienced. In the case of portable art, for example, many artworks have very long, within the biographical paradigm, very long lives, and they have changed throughout these very long-term lives. So I want to exemplify this with the research on Iberian late Bronze Age stelae. Probably most of you have heard about them. There has been a lot of research about them, and also some recent publications, recent books. There are around 150. They are distributed mainly in southwest Iberia. And as you can see here, these are potentially mobile stones. They have, they are usually large enough to be, I mean, you can move them, but you will need the help of maybe another person, or a group of people can move them, but they are usually large enough so that you cannot move them on your own. These stones are richly decorated, usually on one of their sides, but of course also the stones themselves have been dressed. And this is something that has not been looked at very frequently or at all. Here you can see a range of images. They are usually represented following certain conventions. So there are a set of images that are recurrently, repeated. We have human figures, very schematic. We have shields, we have swords, we have spears, we have mirrors. These are artifacts that are circulating throughout the Iberian Peninsula during the late Bronze Age, and we know the material correlates for them. So one of the most recent books that were published in English by Richard Harrison was mainly a catalog of these kind of artworks, or decorated stones. And interestingly, even though he paid attention to the temporality of stelae, so he looked at possible later interventions, later modifications of the carvings of the compositions, his research was mainly based on secondary literature, so he didn't engage directly with the stelae themselves. So he visited the museums, but he didn't really conduct new recordings, he didn't analyze them in detail. So as a result, in his book, he provides a new kind of classification of motifs, of compositions. And here you can see, for example, this is one of the main contributions of his book is that, he proposes that there is an evolution from basic compositions to more elaborate compositions. So we have the basic pattern composed of shield, spear, and sword, and then we have them with other motifs like anthropomorphic figures and other elements that are circulating throughout Spain during the late Bronze Age. The problem with this is that, well, first of all, you will see that the stelae themselves, the stones, are not represented. So these are two-dimensional images, and they are in a way out of context. And even if we are archaeologists and we are so much concerned about context, about material culture, these kind of images are rather common in prehistoric art studies. Another problem with this is that most of these stelae have not been analyzed, reanalyzed in detail. And the problem is that many of these images could have been added later. Some of them could have been modified, recarved. So we're building here categories, classes, types on things that we're just we're just seeing them as this, but they may not correspond to what there is. So probably these decorated stones are richer. They are not so as simplified as we represent them. So here we can see that, for example, classifications can be tricky because in some occasions we see that these kind of iconographies were carved on stones that have been previously dressed, as in this case we have a statue menhir. So there have been some problems in classifying this. Is this a statue? Is this stelae? So these kind of problems come from this kind of very strict classifications that are not really flexible enough to account for the kind of complexity that these artworks materialize, and and all the relationships that they may suggest. So these decorated stones may be carved on older dressed stones. They may be recarved, they may be fragmented, they may be reused. So they may have been engaged in many different ways with many different actors, and throughout this process they have been participants in the creation of many different relationships that are being missed because of the kind of studies that we're developing on them. So what I propose is that, as many others have proposed already, is that as a complement to this kind of top-down perspectives, which are of course useful as a preliminary engagement with large data sets, it would be very useful to develop bottom-up approaches. That is, looking at every single case, but not applying this kind of generalizing frameworks, but trying to engage with them materially, looking at the specific interaction between people, materials, and places. So between the artworks, their materiality, the people that carved them, the people that have engaged with them more recently. Sorry. So the recent research that we have developed on late Bronze Age stelae has had two main components. One of them has been looking at the carving techniques and also looking in detail, analyzing in detail their surfaces to look at not only the carving techniques but also the process, the carving or recarving or later engagements or later modifications that these stelae have experienced. And also conducting a replication experiment to just look at how could be like how carving something similar like a late Bronze Age stelae could have been with a type of stone that we knew and with students from Southampton that had no experience in rock carving whatsoever. So it was more to see the amount of skill that was needed and also the time that you need to deploy to make one of these kind of stones. Sorry. So there are various cases, mainly located in southern Iberia. Some of them had already been studied, and different recordings of them had been produced. In some cases, they were conflicting, interpretations of the same stone with the same engravings. Here we have another one, and you see the kind of images that were being produced in general, devoid of volume, and they were just two-dimensional line drawings. And of course, in the descriptions that were offered, no attention was paid or no account was given about the techniques deployed in their manufacture or in the possible long-term biographies of these stones. So we also deployed RTI to look at the texture of the surfaces of stones, not only to look at the marks made by the different carving techniques, but also to see if there were sequences between lines, for example, some lines cutting other previous lines, or also later interventions. And one of the amazing things is that from these 4 cases, which were like following the traditional typologies, they were classified after, they were more or less reproducing the same type of iconography. They were classified as the same type of stelae. They were reproducing the same type of conventions. But then, with this kind of detailed analysis, we could see many differences arising. For example, not only in the techniques deployed in carving human images, but also in the style, like the outline of the individual images. For example, comparing the different human images or the different shields, or, for example, the preparation of the stone surface. And here there are some cases. For example, the 2 central stelae, one of them, the images were produced just with pecking. On the other case, it was made with pecking and also braiding. So the process of elaboration was different in every case. And here we have the replication experiment. So the experiment was conducted in the same farm where this stela was found. And we selected for that the same type of a stone. So we knew more or less the type, well, we knew because we did petrography, we knew that it was a micoschist, and we already had late Bronze Age stela. So we just collected stones from the area to see if the available material was enough to work the stone, but also, of course, we had flint, which is not local. And we conducted, well, the students mainly, the process. They started to manufacture a stela by working on the surface, by drawing on it with stones, just with the tools that were given. And the result wasn't that bad at all. I mean, it in a way, it was, the representations produced were better than some of the stelae that are known in Southwest Iberia, which look pretty basic. So the ones that you have been before are quite elaborate, but there are some that seem to have been made in a rush, in a way. So they are not very carefully made, and that's a very important aspect to take into account, because all these late Bronze Age stelae are considered as part of one category, we don't make that kind of differentiations, and that's important because some of them would have required much more skill, much more time to be produced, and some others not. And I think that's a qualitative difference that needs to be taken into account. And the same here. For example, with this experiment, we could see that even though we were working with the same type of stone, both of them were mica schist, because of the structure of the stone itself was different, the product was different, and also the process of making was different. So the students found more difficulty in working one of the stones than the other. Okay. So what's the conclusion of all this, of applying RTI and conducting a replication experiment? So the idea was to see if a bottom-up approach, if a focus on making could contribute something to the study of rock art, but in particular the study of late Bronze Age Iberian stelae. Because we have been offered many different classifications, typologies, and these typologies have had an enormous impact in the way we interpret this kind of remains, because types have been interpreted in terms of ethnic identities, or in terms of ideologies, or in relation to interaction of the populations of the western area of Iberia with Atlantic or the Mediterranean. So the result of this kind of bottom-up approach, even though it's a very small number of cases, was clear. On the one hand, it revealed the importance of difference. So even though we were working with the same type of stela, even though they were found very close by, because two of them, for example, were found just 2 kilometers away from each other, and they were reproducing exactly the same categories of objects. So the result of that is that difference matters. So there are differences in the outline of individual motifs. There are differences in the techniques deployed to manufacture them. Maybe that's related to the specific type of stone, but also maybe that's also related to the specific skill of different engravers. And also, I didn't comment on that before, but there was one stela in which there were also images, other images that didn't seem to be part of the composition, that were in the lower part of one stela. And they seemed to be upside down, so indicating that maybe that stone itself had a previous a previous life. I don't like to use that word, but had a previous trajectory before being carved with this composition. And so it's all these elements that bring complexity to this kind of data sets, no? And I think top-down and bottom-up perspectives need to be complementary to account for the complex relationships in which these kind of materials were involved and are still involved. So, okay. I would also like to thank Ingmarie and Andy for the invitation to participate in this session. So my presentation is going to be a little bit less exotic, maybe not so exciting, but it's based on some recent research on some Iberian stelae, and the idea is to show, like, in response to the session proposal, to contribute to, for example, the stone in the case of rock art, also in the case of statues, or the temporality of materials, how things have changed, or the transformations that they have experienced. In the case of portable art, for example, many artworks have very long, well, within the biographical paradigm, very long lives, and they have changed throughout these very long-term lives. So I want to exemplify this with the research on Iberian late Bronze Age stelae. Probably most of you have heard about them. There has been a lot of research about them, and also some recent publications, recent books. This question: what would a focus on art making bring to our dealings or research on prehistoric art? So prehistoric art has been traditionally studied as iconography devoid of materiality. There has been a lot of description been made, and usually images have been conceptualized as finished products. So there are many works, classic works, that we are all using for prehistoric art research that present images, rock art. That's the way we have approached them initially. But the problem with that is that then we are ignoring key aspects, especially for us as archaeologists, to understand them in historical terms. Well, in historical terms, in social terms, in ontological terms, independently of the theoretical perspective or the approach you want to deploy. So in this kind of traditional approaches or research, materials have not been considered, have not been analyzed. Manufacture techniques have also usually been ignored, and also the temporality of portable art, statue menhirs, as finished products or as artworks that were made just in one intervention. The problem with that is that, and the production, like the result of this kind of research, is many categories, many types, many genres, which are necessary in a way to initially approach like large data sets, because we need to, first of all, have a previous idea of what we have in front of us. As I will show you with late Bronze Age stelae,